The last time I saw my father alive, he was sitting on the old cedar porch, the Georgia dusk draped around him like a fading prayer. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and magnolias, the kind of scent that made you believe time could stand still if you wanted it badly enough. He was thinner than I remembered from my last visit, his hands trembling as he lifted his coffee. But his eyes, those green, unwavering eyes, were exactly as they'd always been. "Sit with me, Maggie," he said, patting the space beside him. His voice was soft, as if speaking too loudly might scare away the moment. I sat. The boards creaked under our combined weight, their song one I'd known since childhood. For a while we didn't speak. We just listened to the chorus of crickets, the distant roll of the Savannah River, the whisper of leaves brushing against the old shutters. Then he turned to me, his gaze steady in the dying light. "I've taken care of everything for you." It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. As if these were words he'd been holding in his pocket for years, waiting for the exact moment they'd matter most. "You'll never be without a home, Maggie. Never have to beg for anything from anyone. Not as long as you live." I didn't know it then, but that would be the last promise he ever made to me. 2 days later, I was staring at his coffin as the church bells tolled low and the sky threatened rain. The house was full of voices that day, neighbors in pressed suits, old family friends whispering prayers, women from the parish setting casseroles on the dining table like offerings. Somewhere in the crowd, my mother moved like a shadow, her black veil hiding more than her grief. Victor found me by the kitchen doorway, his tie loosened, his lips curled into something that might have passed for a smile to anyone who didn't know him. "We need to talk," he said, and there was no mistaking the steel under his words. I followed him into my father's study, the place that had always smelled faintly of tobacco and old pine. The will, my father's will, lay on the desk, folded neatly in thirds. Victor didn't sit. He didn't even look at me. He picked up the paper, tore it once, twice, again, and again until it was nothing but confetti in his hands. "Now," he said, letting the pieces scatter to the floor, "you have nothing. Either serve us, or find yourself on the street." I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, the scent of torn paper mixing with the phantom smell of my father's cologne. The thing about betrayal is, it doesn't come all at once. It seeps in like water through a cracked roof, slow at first, then faster, until one day you realize you're drowning. That day was just the first drop. I left the study without a word, pushing past the murmurs in the hall, the smell of lemon pie cooling in the kitchen. Outside, the storm my father had always warned me about had finally come. The rain was warm, relentless, and it hit my face like the world was trying to wash away every trace of the life I'd known. Somewhere deep inside me, something small cracked, but it didn't break. Not yet. I was 38 years old when I stepped back into that house not as a daughter, but as something less defined. Less human, even. A shadow in my own home. And yet, even then, even with Victor's words still burning in my ears, I heard my father's voice from that last night on the porch. "I've taken care of everything for you." It would take me 25 years to understand that sometimes a promise can be stolen, but never entirely erased. Not if you're willing to fight for it. If you want, I can move into section 2 next, which will start building the tension of her first days living under her brother's rule, blending atmospheric details with a slow tightening of the noose. The first morning after the funeral, the house didn't feel like my father's anymore. The light came through the tall windows the same way, but it was colder somehow, stripped of the warmth that used to live in every beam. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed louder, like it was counting down to something I couldn't yet name. I had slept in the guest room, the same room where Edward and I had stayed during holidays, only now it smelled faintly of mothballs and stale air. My suitcase sat untouched by the bed. The dresses I'd brought were neatly folded, as if I already knew unpacking them would be pointless. Victor appeared in the doorway without knocking. His suit was perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle in sight. He leaned against the frame as if he were the master of the house, and in some cruel way, he was. "Breakfast is at 7, he said, eyes sweeping over the room like an inspector searching for faults. "Don't be late." Something in me bristled. 7? For what reason? His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. "Because I said so." He left before I could answer, his footsteps receding down the hallway, the scent of his cologne lingering like a warning. At the dining table, the atmosphere was suffocating. Mama sat at the head, her black veil gone but her hair perfectly pinned, a string of pearls resting against her throat. She stirred her tea slowly, each clink of the spoon against the china deliberate, measured. "Sit," she said without looking at me. The place set for me was at the far end of the table, as if I were a distant relative visiting out of obligation. Jerome sat quietly beside her, pale and thin, his hands trembling as he buttered his toast. He offered me the smallest of smiles, more of an apology than a greeting. Victor spoke about the lumber business as if nothing had changed, as if the coffin in the earth outside meant less than a quarterly profit report. Mama listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes sliding over me only when Victor did. When breakfast was over, Mama placed her teacup down and folded her hands in her lap. "Your situation," she began, "has changed." I waited, my heart picking up its pace. "You'll be staying here," she continued. "In the cottage out back. It's modest, but you'll make do. There will be duties, keeping the house in order, preparing meals, tending the garden. It will be easier than living alone in Charleston with no one to look after you. Look after me." The words tasted bitter. "I have my own life in Charleston," I said carefully. "I have Edward," Victor interrupted with a low chuckle. "Your life in Charleston is over, Maggie. You're part of this household now. Best to accept it." I felt the air thicken between us, as if the house itself was leaning in to hear my answer. My father's study door was closed, but I imagined the shredded will still lying on the floor inside, every piece of it a silent witness. That afternoon, Victor walked me to the cottage. The path was lined with camellias my father had planted years ago, their petals bruised by last night's rain. The cottage door groaned when he opened it. Inside, the walls were yellowed with age, and the single window was clouded with grime. A thin mattress lay on a metal frame, and in the corner, a chipped basin sat atop a warped dresser. "You'll be comfortable here," he said. "I'll have someone bring your things." Before leaving, he stepped close enough that I could see the faint scar above his eyebrow from when he'd fallen out of the pecan tree as a boy. "Don't mistake my generosity for weakness," he said. "This arrangement is the only thing keeping you off the street." When the door closed, I sat on the bed, the springs groaning under my weight. Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutter, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, the sound sharp in the stillness. I thought of Edward, of our quiet kitchen in Charleston, of the laughter we shared over simple meals. I imagined telling him about this place, about the look in Victor's eyes. But I already knew what Edward would say: "Pack your things, come home." Only this wasn't a matter of packing. This was a trap with walls too high to climb, at least not yet. That night, I lay awake listening to the house beyond the garden. I could hear faint laughter from the dining room, the clink of crystal glasses, Victor's deep voice carrying across the lawn. It was a sound that might have once meant family. Now it was the sound of a fortress closing its gates. And as I stared at the shadowed ceiling, one thought kept looping through my mind like a prayer and a curse all at once. This is not where my story ends. If you want, I can make Section 3 move into the early years of her servitude, compressing them into powerful, suspense-driven beats, so we keep momentum without repeating the original's pacing issues. By the time the magnolias bloomed again, the cottage had begun to feel less like a room and more like a sentence. My days blurred into one another, rising before the sun to prepare Victor's coffee, scrubbing the kitchen tiles until my knees ached, polishing the banister until I could see my warped reflection in the wood. The house was a stage, and I was the invisible stagehand, moving quietly in the wings while the family performed their lives for the world. Guests came and went. Victor entertained politicians and businessmen in the study, his laugh booming over the clink of brandy glasses. Mama drifted through the halls in silk robes, sometimes sharp as a whip, sometimes lost in a fog that seemed to steal her memory in pieces. Jerome stayed mostly in his room, his cough worsening with each season. Then came the winter that changed everything. It was a Sunday morning, bitter cold. The frost had crept over the cottage window in pale lace work, and I was lighting the stove when I heard a faint knock. Not from the door, but from beneath my feet. At first I thought it was the wind. But there it was again, a soft thunk-thunk, as if something had shifted under the floorboards. I crouched down, pressing my palm against the worn wood, and felt the faint give of a loose plank. My heart beat harder than it should have for something so small. I fetched a paring knife from the counter and worked it into the gap. The board lifted with a reluctant groan, and the smell of old dust rose to meet me. Inside the narrow cavity was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free. The cloth was stiff, the knot stubborn, but eventually it gave way to reveal a single object, a thin, battered envelope with my name scrawled across it in a hand I knew too well. Jerome. The postmark was smudged, the paper yellowed at the edges. I sat back on my heels, the cold forgotten, and opened it. Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I have already gone where I can no longer be of help to you. I am sorry. I was never strong enough to fight Victor, but I have watched you endure with a grace that shames me. I cannot leave much, but there is a bank book in your name at Fulton Savings, tucked inside the Bible in my nightstand. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to leave this place if you choose. Leave, Margaret. Before he takes more from you than years. Before he finds a way to take your life, too. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed the letter to my chest, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not the quiet, hidden kind, but deep, shaking sobs that left me breathless. When the tears subsided, a new feeling took their place. Not hope exactly. Something sharper. I hid the letter in the hem of my mattress and slipped into the main house before breakfast. Jerome's door was ajar, his room dark except for the pale strip of light leaking through the curtains. I went to the nightstand, pulled open the drawer, and there it was, the Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside, between Psalms and Proverbs, was the bank book. I opened it. The balance was modest, but it might as well have been gold. Enough for a bus ticket. Enough for a start. For the rest of the day, I moved through my duties with a strange calm. Every plate I washed, every floor I swept, I was thinking, I can leave. But by nightfall, a shadow had settled over the thought. Because leaving meant more than just walking away. It meant leaving Mama in Victor's hands, even in her fractured state. It meant never again setting foot in the house my father had built. It meant admitting that the will was gone forever, that justice would never come. And yet, there was Jerome's warning in the letter. Before he takes your life, too. The wind rattled the shutters as I sat on the bed in the cottage, the bank book heavy in my lap. In the distance, I heard Victor's laugh through the cold night air, and I knew. He wouldn't stop until there was nothing left of me. That was the night I decided I would go. But not quietly. If you'd like, I can make section 4 the high-tension sequence where she begins taking active, dangerous steps to gather leverage against Victor before escaping, bringing in suspense and a race against time feeling. I didn't sleep much after finding Jerome's letter. Every creak of the cottage floor sounded like a warning, every shadow under the door a threat. But fear has a strange way of sharpening your senses. In the days that followed, I began noticing things I had trained myself for years to ignore. Victor's study, for example, was never fully locked. He always turned the key halfway when he left for dinner, a habit born of arrogance more than carelessness. From the hall, I'd sometimes catch the scent of his cigars mingled with something more metallic, the faint tang of old paper and ink. And then there was the painting. It was a garish landscape of the Georgia marshlands, the kind of thing Victor bought to impress guests who pretended to appreciate art. I had dusted it for years, my cloth sliding over its ornate frame, my eyes catching the way it sat just slightly off-kilter against the wall. One night, when the house was quiet and Victor had gone to some late meeting, I stood in the study doorway and looked at it differently, not as decoration, but as a door. Behind that painting was the safe I'd seen him open once, maybe twice, in the early years of my captivity. I remembered the way he'd hunch his shoulders when turning the dial, his voice low, as if whispering to the lock. I'd memorized the numbers without even realizing it, 24, 17, 36, tucked away in the corners of my mind like a song lyric you don't know you know. The thought of what might be inside that safe began to haunt me. My father's will was gone, I'd seen Victor tear it apart, but maybe there were other documents. Proof of the fraud. Proof of worse. And if I had proof, I could do more than leave. I could ruin him. But timing was everything. Victor never left for long, and when he did, he left the house under a web of watchful eyes. Mrs. Ellison from across the street, the gardener, even Mama's nurse when she came by. I needed a window, and fate delivered it in the form of a business trip to New York. 3 days, he told Mama at breakfast, buttering his toast with slow, deliberate strokes. Maybe 4 if the deal takes longer. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face still. The morning he left, the air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I moved through my chores as usual, but inside I was counting hours. That night, I lay awake listening for any sound that didn't belong. Nothing. Only the hum of the old refrigerator in the cottage and the distant rustle of camellias in the wind. The next evening, after the last light had faded from the sky, I stepped into the main house. My feet moved of their own accord, muscle memory guiding me through rooms I'd been cleaning for decades. When I reached the study, my hand trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. The painting was heavier than I remembered. I eased it off the hook and set it against the desk, my breath loud in the stillness. There it was, a black steel door set into the wall, the dial catching the light. I crouched down and began to turn it. 24. Click. 17. Click. 36. The soft release of the mechanism was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. The door swung open with the slow grace of something that knew it hadn't been touched in a while. Inside, neat stacks of folders sat like silent sentinels. Bank statements. Contracts. Letters. A small velvet pouch that clinked when I lifted it. And then, tucked between 2 thick manila envelopes, a folder marked in red, confidential. I opened it, and the room seemed to tilt. There it was. A signed contract between Victor and a lawyer I recognized from my father's funeral. $50,000 in exchange for preparation and execution of a revised will. The signature dates matched exactly 3 months before my father's death. Attached was a notarized statement promising absolute confidentiality under threat of mutual destruction. My fingers shook as I turned the pages. Beneath the contract were receipts for offshore deposits, payments to unnamed consultants, and, most chilling of all, handwritten notes about removing the problem permanently. My name was in those notes. The air in the study grew heavy, pressing down on me. I could leave now, with Jerome's bankbook, and start over quietly. But I knew in that moment that leaving quietly would never be enough. Victor hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd tried to erase me. The decision crystallized then, hard and cold. I wasn't just going to run. I was going to end him. If you'd like, I can make Section 5 the explosive climax, the moment where her secret plan meets the point of no return, with the confrontation and law closing in. The plan was a thread pulled tight, ready to snap with the slightest wrong move. I had only 2 nights left before Victor returned from New York. 2 nights to make sure the evidence left this house without leaving a trace that I'd touched it. I borrowed Mrs. Clara's old Kodak from the linen closet, one of those cameras that clicked loud enough to make your heart stop, and spent the next evening on my knees in the study, photographing every page under the dim light of a banker's lamp. The sound of each shutter felt like a shot in the dark. I didn't just take the will forgery contract. I photographed the offshore bank ledgers, the payoffs to judges, the bribes to county inspectors. And the notes, the ones with my name in them, alongside chilling instructions for gradual doses of something unnamed. I didn't need a poisoner's handbook to understand. When the last roll of film was full, I tucked it into an empty biscuit tin and slid it into the bottom drawer of my cottage desk. Tomorrow, it would leave this place for good. That morning, I made the call. My voice was barely above a whisper as I spoke to the secretary at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tell Mr. Everett Madison that Margaret Anderson has something he's been looking for. By noon, there was a knock at the cottage door. The man standing there wore a delivery uniform, a cap pulled low over his brow. His clipboard was a shield between us. Package for Mrs. Margaret, he said, loud enough for anyone watching from the main house to hear. The biscuit tin passed between us as I signed a name that wasn't mine. His fingers closed around it for a fraction of a second, just enough to let me know, we've got it. The hours that followed stretched and folded into themselves. I made Victor's favorite fried chicken because he'd asked for it before leaving, and because routine was my best disguise, and cleaned the silver until my reflection looked like a stranger's. Every nerve in my body was a live wire. At precisely noon the next day, the sound of tires on gravel reached me before the hum of the engine. Victor's car rolled through the iron gates like a predator returning to its lair. He walked into the house as if it belonged to him, and in his mind, it still did. Is the house in order? Was his first question. Not hello. Not how are you. Yes, I said, steady as stone. Everything's just how you like it. Lunch was served in silence, except for the scrape of his fork against the china. I poured his sweet tea, careful not to let my hands tremble, and when the knock came at the front door, I was already moving to answer it. It wasn't the delivery man this time. It was Mr. Everett himself, flanked by 2 federal agents and a county court officer. The air in the doorway seemed to hum. Good afternoon, he said, his voice formal but charged. We're here for Mr. Victor Anderson. Victor's steps were heavy in the hallway. He appeared with his napkin still tucked into his collar, the picture of a man inconvenienced rather than cornered. And what exactly is this? The agent opened a leather folder, flashing the warrant. Search and seizure for this residence. Arrest for tax evasion, money laundering, will forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. The last charge hit the air like a gunshot. Victor's eyes locked on mine, and in them I saw the exact moment he realized. You, he said, almost a hiss. You did this. I didn't flinch. No, Victor. You did this. I just stopped letting you get away with it. They cuffed him there in the hall, his expensive watch catching the light as his hands were pulled behind his back. He tried to speak, but the agents were already leading him out the door, their boots echoing on the marble like a closing argument. Mr. Everett lingered behind, his voice softer now. You've done more than you know, Mrs. Anderson. We'll take it from here. When the door shut, the silence was a thing I'd never heard in this house before, not absence, but relief. It was the sound of a weight sliding off my chest after 25 years. I walked back to the dining table. Victor's plate was still there, half-eaten, the fork lying crooked across the china. I picked it up and carried it to the sink, rinsing away the last traces of his presence. For the first time in decades, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the gates were already open. And this time I knew I would walk through them. If you want, I can write Section 6 as the emotionally rich aftermath, where Margaret chooses her new life and reflects on her transformation, tying the arc to an intimate, cinematic closing image. The weeks after Victor's arrest passed in a haze of lawyers' meetings, statements to investigators, and the surreal experience of walking through the mansion without feeling watched. His absence wasn't silence, it was oxygen. I slept in the master bedroom for the first time in my life. The mattress was softer than the one in the cottage, the air warmer, the view of the garden unobstructed by rusted shutters. But it wasn't peace yet. The walls still held decades of swallowed words and stolen years, and every creak of the floorboards reminded me of how long I'd been invisible here. When the court ruled in my favor, nullifying the forged will and returning my father's assets to me, I felt no rush of triumph, just a deep, steady release, as if my body had finally unclenched after a lifetime of holding its breath. The company, the accounts, the deeds, they were mine on paper. But I knew in my bones they were stained beyond repair. That's why, one autumn morning, I walked into my lawyer's office with a signed donation agreement. The mansion, with its chandeliers and polished banisters, would become a shelter for women escaping abuse, women who, like me, had once been told they were lucky to have a roof over their heads while that roof doubled as a cage. I wanted to be a place where someone can walk in with nothing, I told her, and know they are worth everything. It took 6 months to settle the sale of the company and liquidate the properties. By the time the checks cleared, winter had given way to the pale green of early spring. I packed what little I cared to keep into 3 suitcases, photographs of my father, Jerome's letter, the biscuit tin, empty now, but still mine, and a few worn cookbooks with notes in my grandmother's handwriting. The day I left Atlanta, The sky was the same flat gray it had been on the day of my father's funeral. But this time, I wasn't walking into a house stripped of promise. I was walking away from one. The train to California cut across the country like a clean line on a map. I watched the landscape change, brick towns giving way to endless fields, mountains rising like sentinels in the distance. Somewhere in Arizona, I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older, yes, but also unburdened. When I stepped off the bus in Monterey, the air tasted different, salted, alive. The sea spread out before me in a silver sweep, its horizon wide and unbroken. I had never seen the ocean before. Rivers, yes. Rain, yes. But never water that went on until it touched the sky. My apartment was small, a second-floor walk-up near Cannery Row, with a balcony just big enough for a chair and a row of herb pots. The first night, I sat there with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the waves pull at the shore. The rhythm was patient, unhurried. No one could lock it in a safe or tear it into pieces. Life settled into a new kind of quiet. I learned to make tea from my balcony garden, to walk to the market without looking over my shoulder, to smile at neighbors without wondering what they might report back. I made friends, real ones, at the senior center, women who laughed without malice and asked questions without an agenda. And there was Douglas, a retired consultant who stopped by one afternoon to deliver financial paperwork from my attorney. He stayed for tea, then for dinner, and then for years. He was kind in a way that didn't make me suspicious, and patient enough to wait for me to believe it was safe to love again. We married on the beach at sunset, with only a few friends and the tide as witness. When he passed, I didn't crumble. I grieved, but I didn't collapse into the hollow self I once was. Because by then, I knew the truth. My life was my own. Now, at 78, my mornings begin the same way, coffee on the balcony, the herbs brushing against my arm in the wind, the sea breathing in and out. Sometimes I think of Victor, still behind bars. Sometimes I think of my father's last words. But mostly, I think of tomorrow. There's a kind of freedom that comes from knowing you've already survived the worst. It doesn't make the waves smaller, but it makes you certain you can swim. And on nights when the moon lays a silver path across the water, I close my eyes and imagine walking it, each step carrying me farther from the house with locked doors and closer to the horizon that no one can take from me. If you'd like, I can now stitch sections 1 to 6 into a seamless full narrative, smoothing pacing and transitions so it reads like a polished, complete story.